try going through your photo albums and think of all the experiences that went into them. And when you look at the photos, you think of the memories that they captured. Well, there's one person who captured 330 years of the Jewish American experience, a very monumental task, and he achieved it. Allon Schoener, who's with us today, put all the 330 years together in the American Jewish Album, which is really an exquisite collection of the Jewish American experience. And Allon Schoener is very qualified to put just this project together because he has served as a staff member, consultant, and exhibit designer for the Smithsonian Institute, Library of Congress, United Nations, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He also has another kudo because his Lower East Side exhibit at the Jewish Museum in New York was probably the most popular in the museum's history. And with that, I introduce you to Allon Schoener. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Allon, I'd like to ask you someone else's question. After relaying to a person that Wyatt Earp's wife was Jewish, that Sandy Koufax is Jewish, he asked, what difference does it make if they're Jewish? Now I ask you, what difference does it make?
Well, Jews have a preoccupation with wanting to know who's Jewish. I don't know why. I mean, whenever they travel any place in the world, the first people they look for are other Jews. I mean, it doesn't make any difference whether if they go to China, they're going to look for Chinese Jews. Or if they go to India, they're going to look for Indian Jews. Or if they go to Chicago, they're going to look for Jews in Chicago. So that's just a preoccupation. It's a built-in characteristic of Jews.
I mean, the celebrities are Jewish. Do you think there's the identification process?
No, I don't think it's so much an identification process with celebrities. I think that Jews are just interested with people who had similar experiences to their own. And the Jewish experience is a very different and a very unique experience. Historically, it's been different. And I think Jews tend to, not because they want to separate themselves from the rest of the community, but they certainly want to identify with people who had experiences of a similar nature.
We happen to have a visual overview of the 330 years of history, so if we can take a look at that now.
Well, they came in 1654 to New York City, and the first group of Jews who came on ships such as this from the colony, the Dutch colony of Recife in Brazil. They left that colony and came to New York, and here we see a Jewish department store in Philadelphia in the middle of the 18th century. They quickly adapted themselves to American business and commercial situations. This is an aspect of American Jewish life that most people don't really know about. It's the Jews in the far west in the mining towns. This is a small town called Mokelumne Hill, which was a gold rush mining town in California in the 1850s. And among the stores in this small town, which you see in the insets at the bottom, were stores that were operated by Jews. Most people tend to think of Jews as living in the large metropolitan centers, but not in small.
They were actually one of the first people to settle.
They were.
In Los Angeles.
And this is a wonderful photograph that I love that shows Jewish Union soldiers visiting their relatives in Georgia after the Union Army conquered Georgia. And again, maybe one of the things that is unique about Jews, and it's what I was saying before about Jews seeking out other Jews, those kinds of differences don't exist from one place to another. This is a Jewish family, German Jewish family in Philadelphia around 1890. And the German Jews were very prominent in the Philadelphia community at that particular time. There was a difference between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews who arrived during the last quarter of the 19th century and through the first quarter of the 20th century.
Which we'll get into later when we talk about the immigration.
Yes, and
this is Ellis Island?
And this is Ellis Island.
But how many people filtered through Ellis Island?
I think that there were close to 3.5 million people who filtered, or 4 million people who filtered through Ellis Island.
Irish, Polish,
Italian. Jewish, Greek, Italian. And this is my family photograph. It's my grandmother and grandfather, the two figures in the center, with some of my aunts and uncles and cousins who are much older than I am. And this is a Lower East Side photograph. It's Hester Street in New York City, the crowded urban environment into which most of the Eastern European Jews settled on their first arrival in New York City.
What about the future? Will they remain like Maxwell Street in Chicago?
Well, this neighborhood is no longer, well, Hester Street has Jewish shops, but there aren't Jews living on it. I think the population now is mostly Puerto Rican. This is a very interesting photograph taken in the 1920s of a citizenship class run by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. And it was a time in which they were helping the Eastern European Jews adapt to life in the United States and to learn the necessities of becoming a citizen and to pass their examinations.
Also the answer to survival.
Absolutely.
In America.
This is my favorite photograph in the book. It's a photograph of Jesse Lasky, the movie producer who was one of the founders of Paramount Studios, with his stud sports car after he completed a transcontinental trip across the United States in the mid-1920s.
He was also a partner with Cecil B. DeMille, wasn't he?
He was. And this is Benny Goodman, who comes from Chicago, with his swing band, as it appeared on the Camel Caravan radio show.
One of many Jewish entertainers at the time.
Yes. And this is a scene from Oklahoma, which is not a Jewish theme. It's a well-established American theme, a musical comedy, which was written and produced by two Jews, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein.
Even provide baby pictures of Richard Rodgers.
That's
which
right.
is very charming. The future musical writer.
And that's Leonard Bernstein, who certainly is a well-known face to everyone in the world today. A brilliant composer, pianist, educator. It's hard to say. I mean, a Renaissance man in the 20th century. And a marvelous human being. And here are two very well-known leaders of the women's movement in the United States, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, preparing a large telegram to send to President Carter in support of the ERA amendment.
This is reminiscent of Clara Lemlich, who instigated the shirtwaist makers strike in 1909. There's always a Jewish woman there.
That's right, there were. And here are Jewish men, Hasidim in Brooklyn. And I think this, to me, is an absolutely fascinating photograph. The followers of Rabbi Schneerson, Menachem Schneerson.
Which I say, and I hope people hold it lightly, I call it Hassidivision. It's Rabbi Schneerson, who actually was on cable television.
He has his regular show worldwide.
That's right. Proclaiming Hasidism to the world. That was fascinating. That was a very quick overview of 330 years. It was in 1655 that the Jews were actually permitted to maintain their own cemeteries. And this came despite Peter Stuyvesant, the governor at the time, his orders to expel the Jews. How did they achieve that? Well,
the Jews who arrived in New York City in the 1650s were refugees from the Dutch colony in Brazil, Recife. And as part of the peace treaty, when the Portuguese conquered Brazil and took the territory away from the Dutch, was a provision that permitted the Jews to leave the Dutch colony and to go to another Dutch territory. It's questionable as to whether the Jews who went to New York City went to New York with a specific intention of going there, or maybe they conceivably arrived there in a storm. But in any case, 24 of them arrived on this ship in the year 1654. When they arrived, Peter Stuyvesant was not happy about having them there and protested to the Dutch West India Company because there were Spanish and Portuguese Jews who had settled in Amsterdam and who were but who had an interest in the Dutch West India Company. They petitioned the leaders of the Dutch West India Company to permit the Jews who were in New York City, I'm sorry, not New York City, New Amsterdam.
Amsterdam at the time.
At the time, to stay there. And that's how they managed to be able to establish a cemetery, and that's how they managed to be able to
Which always seems to be important in Jewish history. That always gave them their sense of identity, and also in Denmark, allowing them to maintain and build their own cemeteries.
Well, that's one of the traditions of Jewish life. In other words, is to have a synagogue and to have a cemetery. In other words, Jews have always been, as far as we know, for hundreds and thousands of years, in a state of diaspora. And as they have moved around from one country to another, they have developed these techniques of establishing their own community in a new location. And one of the first things that they do after, or even at the same time, is they establish a religious center. They also establish a cemetery.
And burial society. Well, you said they established different communities. They start to move into the South in the 1700s. How did they establish the Jewish community there?
Well, the first Jewish community in the South was established in there were two of them, I'm sorry, in Charleston, South Carolina, and in Savannah, Georgia. And again, I guess that we don't think of Jews as having been in those places, but they were there shortly after the colonies were first established. In fact, the Jews arrived in Savannah, Georgia in 1743, the first year in which the colony itself was actually established. And they were among the first settlers there. Charleston and Savannah were port cities, and the Jews who arrived in the United States at that particular time, or in the English colonies, which was really the political nature of the country at that moment, were in most cases Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and they had been involved in international trading of some sort or another, so that it was logical for them to settle in these coastal towns and then to, in other words, become involved in international commerce in some way in those towns. Now, later in the 19th century, German Jews began to arrive in the United States, and that was the second main wave of migration, and it's the second chapter in my book. In this wave of migration, the German Jews who arrived bypassed the coastal cities. Very few of them settled in New York or Philadelphia or Newport, Rhode Island, or Charleston or Savannah. They went off into the small towns in the hinterland, and they established retail dry goods stores, or they started off, in most cases, as peddlers first, with a horse and wagon. And it's my contention that many of the people whom we assume were Yankee peddlers could well have been German Jewish peddlers traveling either with packs on their backs or with horses and wagons.
Well, you provide charming testimonials in here, and one man arrives to the States and he says he sees someone as a peddler. Here was a prominent man out in the old country. He says he couldn't see himself doing that, and there he was peddling, and decided it's a way to make a living.
Well, that was the entrance route for most German Jews at that particular time into the economy of the United States. It also, I mean, my grandfather came to this country, and that was the first thing that he did. It was much later. He didn't do this until I guess it was probably the 1880s or 1890s when he arrived in this country.
As they established themselves in the various cities, how politically involved did they get? You document that in 1813, Mordecai Emanuel Noah was appointed consul to Tunis by President James Madison. What is the signal for the Jews as far as their political involvement?
Well, I think that at that particular time, really almost up until I'd say the Roosevelt administration in the 20th century, Jews were not a major political force in American life. They tended to withdraw from politics and to really be, I think, to be concerned with probably the protection of the Jewish community more than participating in the general political life of the community. For example, during the Civil War, the Jews who lived in the North supported the Union Army and in most cases were anti-slavery. The Jews who lived in the South, in most cases, supported slavery and in some cases were slave owners and supported the Confederate government. So that there was a schism between in other words, the Jewish community in the United States as much as there was throughout the rest of the community in the United States over the Civil War. But I think to identify Jews largely with liberal causes or participation in the labor movement or anything else before the beginning of the 20th century wouldn't be correct, because they really didn't do that. Now, it has a lot to do with the growth of the Eastern European Jewish community in the United States, because the Eastern European Jewish community, most of the leadership for it came from Russia. And many of the people who arrived at that time, at the last quarter of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, many of the intellectual leaders were already socialists, so that they brought their interest in socialist politics and their interest in radical concerns to the United States with them. They founded journals, they founded political parties. The Jews were very active in the formation of the Socialist Party in the United States.
Concern for social justice.
That's right. I mean, that's a long-established Jewish tradition that goes back to the Bible. And in addition to that, they were very actively involved in the foundation of some of the first trade unions in the United States, particularly in the garment industry. And there were women who were leaders of those union
We're still following in that tradition.
That's right.
You said it wasn't until later that the Jewish community established itself as the advocates of social justice. But I believe in 1840 a letter to President Van Buren was written denouncing the mistreatment of Jews in Damascus. Was this really the first sign of the Jewish lobby?
I think it has a lot to do with the way that Jews probably felt about them in the felt about themselves in the United States. That you have to think back in terms of what Jewish conditions were in other parts of the world, even at this time. And in Russia, they were suppressed. In Germany, they were suppressed. And in the United States, there was the freedom to be able to express Jewish concerns about Jewish interests. So that I think that was probably one of the first times that the Jews came together as a community and relayed their concern about the treatment of Jews in another place to the American political establishment. It also is interesting to be able to note that they were able to reach the President of the United States and address a letter to him and also to have a response from him.
That's right. And, well, up until now, there was no centralized organization.
There were no centralized Jewish organizations.
And then how did B'nai B'rith evolve? That was really at the forefront.
Well, B'nai B'rith was the first of the national Jewish organizations, and actually it started off as a benevolent lodge for the German Jewish community, and it started off almost as a kind of insurance protection fund, so that it provided a community service for the Jews as a specific segment within the total American community. But it was a service organization, and it wasn't really originally established as what could be described as a self-protective organization, or as now organizations like the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and the American Jewish Congress are called defense organizations. It was in the sense that they defend the rights of the Jewish community in the United States.
There was one organization, well, not a Jewish one, that really readily, this was years later, that readily accepted Jews. One of the first ones, the Masons.
I know, that was one of the things that I was surprised about myself in terms of my own discoveries in doing research for this book. And I found a Mason certificate, which was the property of a friend of mine in Cincinnati, whose husband's, I guess, great-great-grandfather's name was Adler, and lived in Cairo, Illinois. And this was in 1858 that he was a member of the Masons in Cairo, Illinois. And I guess that there are probably still in the United States today many Jews who've been able to join the Masons, but it was one of the very few fraternal organizations in the United States that long ago that accepted Jews.
You spoke briefly about the Civil War during the slides. How did the restoration and the renovation and reconstruction afterwards help the Jews?
Well, I think one of the things that happened was that there was a need for capital, in a sense venture capital in the United States after the Civil War. The German Jews, who first started off, as we talked about before, started off as peddlers with packs on their backs and then moving to horses and wagons and then to dry goods stores, then went one step further and set up wholesale dry goods organizations. Now, out of building up small financial fortunes in this way, they then moved into an area which is called merchant banking. And there were people like the Seligman family and the Lehmans who evolved out of this background, who became merchant bankers and participated in the financing of the railroads and the expansion into the West. So that there was a sense of speculative capital in which these Jewish banking firms provided that had a lot to do with the economic expansion of the United States at that particular time.
What's interesting to note, you mentioned Seligman here. As much clout as he had, as much power as he had, he was still refused admittance to the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga.
In Saratoga Springs in 1877.
That's right. One area we haven't talked about, I think people rarely associate cowboys with Judaism. You just don't hear of Jewish cowboys. But Wyatt Earp's wife was Jewish, and he was buried in a Jewish cemetery. Was that popular?
Well, you see, I think one of the things that perhaps I would say is another discovery that people can make in going through my book is that there were Jews who were living on the frontier. Not only on the frontier at the end of the 19th century, but they were living on the frontier in the 18th century. And I think we tend to associate Jewish life in the United States with the large metropolitan cities like New York or Chicago or Philadelphia or some of the smaller, or I should say today Los Angeles, where there certainly is an extremely large Jewish community. But we seldom think of Jews being sprinkled around all across the country in small towns. Now, Wyatt Earp's wife was one of many Jews who lived in the far west. There were Jewish dry goods stores and Jewish cigar merchants, Jewish newspaper dealers sprinkled all throughout Arizona and New Mexico, Montana, Colorado. And there's one photograph that I love in the book of a man by the name of Charles Strauss who's standing with a gun.
Yeah.
This photograph of him, and he was the mayor of Tucson, Arizona. Well, this is not a conventional photograph or a conventional image that most people expect of a Jew. Or the other photograph of the family picnic in Montana, where all these people are sitting around, and they're Jews sitting with 6 guns in holsters around their waists. So I think that you can say that
Frisco Kid, yeah.
Yeah, you can say that Wyatt Earp's wife is a part of an aspect of the Jewish community that many of us are not familiar with.
We're going to have to skip some periods in Jewish history and arrive at Ellis Island. At this time, 2 million immigrants arrived, marking the largest wave of immigration of Jews in the country. How did the non-Jews and the German Jews react to this immigration of European Jews?
Well, first of all, the non-Jewish reaction was part of a general reaction toward all immigrants who were coming to the United States at this particular time. Most of the immigrants who came at the end of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century were people who came from southern and central Europe. Most of them came from rural backgrounds. Few of them were educated, and most of them, in a sense, could be classified as coming from peasant backgrounds. So that when they arrived in the United States, they were not educated, few of them had trades, and the people who had already established themselves in the United States looked down upon them. And there also was a long-established nativist tradition in the United States whereby the newest immigrant group was always looked down upon by the previous group. So that I would say that the Eastern European Jews who arrived in the United States were grouped together with all of these southern and central, southern and central European Jews in a mass by the general American public. Now, the German Jews had a very special view of the Eastern European Jews. They were embarrassed by them because the German Jews had arrived almost 2 generations before. Many of them had become very successful in business, had become very well educated, and they saw these Eastern European Jews as eroding their social position in the United States.
In fact, it was the immigrant Jews who ended up working in the German Jew sweatshops.
Exactly.
I believe. We have to move on because I want to try and cover everything. Obviously, we can't cover everything. You spent a lot of time on the arts, the Jewish contribution. In fact, you were art history major at Yale University. We see Benny Goodman, as we saw Leonard Bernstein. There really is a good number of Jewish artists in all fields in comparison to their numbers. Would you say any Judaism is infused into their work?
Well, I also worked at the Jewish Museum for a while, and I think that that's a very difficult question because, you see, I think that the people who are Jewish artists and creative people don't necessarily see that as a manifestation of their Jewish religion, but I think they probably see it as a manifestation of Jewish traditions, or perhaps of Jewish cultural traditions or Jewish intellectual traditions. Jews are very much, they're called the people of the book. You know, I mean, it's a long, historically established tradition over thousands of years, so that the concern for cultural identification is a very important part of Jewish life. And I know that in my family, I mean, my father always had his nose in a book. And that's just something that I think I learned, and it rubbed off on me. It's rubbed off on my kids. I mean, being involved with art or music or literature, those seem to be natural concerns in most Jewish families.
Another tradition, in the minute we have left, is this need and this advocacy of social justice. And we can go back to Emma Goldman, the shirtwaist makers, to Abby Hoffman. Is that part of the Jewish heritage?
I would like to think so. I identify with it without question. And I think that it's clearly something that I've been able to document in my book. It's something in which Jews are concerned about protection of Jewish rights, and in the process of being concerned about the protection of Jewish rights, Jews are always a minority in the society in which they live. So therefore, to protect their own rights, they really have to be concerned about other people's rights. So the social justice is always a major issue in Jewish life.
In summary, were there any sine curves that you could tell patterns throughout the 330 years?
Well, I think that the one thing that I would say is that the present moment in American Jewish life may well be, you know, one of the most glorious periods in world Jewish history. I mean, Jews have really made an enormous contribution to American life as a whole, and I think that one of the things that I hope that my book would be able to do is to perhaps set a precedent for other minority groups in the United States to be able to look upon their own cultural history in the same way, and to perhaps be able to put together a catalog of their achievements that looks as glorious as the catalog of Jewish achievements in the United States.
Well, it is exceptional. Allon Schoener, you successfully accomplished the monumental task of putting together 330 years of history of the Jews in America, and I want to thank you for sharing the American Jewish Album with us today. And for Focus, I'm Deborah Palmer.